Jananing Sharadang Deving Ramakrishnam Jagat Gurum Pada Padmitayo Sritva Pranamami Muhurmu. So I welcome you all on behalf of the Institute of Culture, Gold Park, to Mr. Samar Kanti Memorial Lecture. This lecture was instituted on December 9, 2020. So it is our usual practice to give you an idea about the great life that Mr. Samar Kanti lived with us. He was born in Rangoon in 1942, the eldest son of Sri Jyotish Chandra Pal and Srimati Parul Pal. At the time of his birth, World War II, the Second World War was raging. The Japanese were bombing the city, hence the name Samar. Later, the family migrated to Bhattanagar, a small locality in Lilua, Howrah. Young Samar made his mark early as a brilliant student of Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandir in Belur. He stood third in ISC board examination 1959, the first ever student from Vidya Mandir to receive a top 10 board rank in the science stream. In addition, he was a handsome young footballer who led his league team to win many trophies and sports prizes. And so he personified the dreams of most Bengali people of his generation, excelling in both academics and football. After graduating from Bengal Engineering College in Shivpuri in 1963 with a gold medal in mechanical engineering, Samar joined the Oil India Limited in Assam. Over the next 2 decades, he became fascinated by the potential of information technology and was one among the first generation of Indian professionals who became experts in IBM mainframe computers. Later, he moved his family back to Calcutta and worked at International Combustion, Tractors India and DCPL. Subsequently, he became an entrepreneur, but his untimely death in 1996 cut short his promising career. In his personal life, Samar was well known for his high energy and grace, strong family bonds and friendships, and an amazing sense of humor. The members of his large and extended family are proud and privileged to be associated with Samar Kanti Memorial Lecture organized by the Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture. And this memorial lecture instituted by Srimati Jayanti Pal, wife, Dr. Shantanu Pal and Dr. Radha Rangarajan, son and daughter-in-law. Srimati Hoimanti Pal's Sarkar and Sri Arijit Sarkar, daughter and son-in-law, Dr. C. Rangarajan, the renowned economist who is going to give today's lecture, ex-governor of Reserve Bank of India, and the father-in-law of Dr. Shantanu Pal, Sri Tarun Kanti Pal, brother, and Srimati Priti Bhomik, sister. Today's Dr. C. Rangarajan will deliver the first Samar Kanti Pal Memorial Lecture. The topic is India at 75 and beyond. So this is, in brief, the life history of Samar Kanti Pal. I have been knowing this family for the last 36 years or so. And I was especially drawn to him, Samar Kanti Pal, because of his handsome figure and beautiful eyes. I didn't have any way to know about his intellectual attainment, but later on I came to know that he was a brilliant student of the Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandir Belur Math. He passed away when much more music was left with him. He could have contributed to our nation in much more way, fruitful way. He was a visionary as well, you know. He changed his profession and started his own firm. And his greatness and his influence in society could be better understood from his son Santanu's contribution to our society. He was also one of the, I should say, the first most illustrious students of Narendrapur. I am not going to the first, but he is one of the 5 illustrious students. And from his attainment, demeanor, we guess that what sort of father he did have. It was a great loss to me personally, because I used to frequently visit them, the family, with Santanu's mother, sister, father. And since he is leaving the college, our relation was never cut off. And when I heard that Radha, daughter of the illustrious Professor C. Rangarajan, had joined him as his wife, and I became much more elated. And I requested him, Santanu, that why don't you invite Professor Rangarajan at Narendrapur to speak? And he did. There are so many sweet memories also there, and at Puri also, you can remember some of Santanu. Professor Rangarajan was then the governor of Andhra and of Odisha as well. So I visited Puri that time to witness Ratha Jatra festival. And I was searching for an IS officer who would give me a ticket to be within the cordon. And then suddenly I met this family, Samar, maybe Radha, with their mother went to the Ramakrishna Mission Center at Puri and spent the morning for an hour or so. And with the help of Professor Rangarajan, I could see not only the Rathajat festival well, but I had the opportunity to go up to the chariot itself. So I fondly remember those incidents. And here now today he is with us. Now the chairman, presently chairman, Madras School of Economics, past governor, Reserve Bank of India, governor, state of Andhra Pradesh, and part-time governor of Odisha also. That has not been written over here, I know that. Member of Rajya Sabha, chairman, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, 2004 to 2014, for 10 years. So now I request Professor Rangarajan to give his speech on India at 75 and beyond. Before that, I cordially welcome him in our midst for being able to come at this age of 90. He agreed to speak because of Santanu, I know, because he is going to speak a memorial lecture which has been dedicated to his very own relation, though made by law, but they are very much involved, very, very much. So I welcome the family also. And also direct family and extended family members are present over here, I just heard, because Radha was speaking to them in Bengali, curiously, and I sense that there may be some relation among them, and they corroborated, yes. The Samar's aunt and also maybe the uncles might have been there. So I welcome you all also and welcome the guests, the listeners. And some of them are the university professors, some of them are from economic discipline as such. And this being a very specialized topic, as usual, I didn't expect our devotees to come listen to such erudite speeches. This I know. That's why I requested some of the brilliant thinkers to be present here to listen to Professor Rangarajan. Rangarajan, kindly. Thank you.
Swami Suprananda, Mrs. Jayanti Paul, members of the Paul's family, distinguished invitees. I am deeply honored and privileged to deliver today's lecture instituted to commemorate the memory of Samar Kanti Paul. He was an extraordinary person who blazed several new trails. As you have heard, after a brilliant academic career, in another important way, he became an entrepreneur. Please remember, this was well before the days of startups. It is very sad that the life of a person with such a brilliant mind and entrepreneurial spirit was cut short at an young age of 54. I just want to relate to you one anecdote which summarizes in many ways Samar Kanti Paul. This was about early 90s when Radha and Santanu were at the University of Michigan and they wanted to get married. So I came to Calcutta to meet Samar Kanti Paul and told him about what is happening and asked him whether he would agree to their marriage. He had his own concerns. He was wondering whether such a marriage would really fructify. And he was talking about the fact two people come from totally different cultures and whether this will not come in the way of a happy unison. But we did discuss about the pros and cons of such a marriage. And finally, he said, we need to wait and see whether this is just a flash or whether they really like each other. And he said, let us wait for 6 months. And if after 6 months they still say they want to get married, I will agree. I thought this was a very wise advice. And we left it to both Santanu and Radha. This was a remarkable thing. It shows several things. His large-heartedness, his grace, and above all, in my view, his rational approach to solve even a highly emotional problem. I shall always remember the call that he made to me. And that summarizes in many ways the character and the style of Samar Kanti Paul. I'm also happy that I'm addressing this lecture under the auspices of Ramakrishna Institute of Culture, which has built up a high reputation for itself over the course of the several years. I had occasion to go around this evening and to see the library. It is a remarkable collection of books, and the museum has, once again, is a treasure house. And therefore I am happy that I have this opportunity to give the lecture under the auspices of the Institute. I plan to speak to you this evening on India at 75 and beyond. India's economic journey actually started after independence. Many people do not know that the British rule in the first 50 years of the 20th century, that is between 1900 and 1950, was dismal. During this period, the growth rate of the economy was something like 0.9% per annum, with the population growing at that time at 0.83%. The per capita income did not grow at all. So that is the record of the British rule in the 5 decades. It is therefore natural that immediately after independence, growth became the major objective of economic policy. The dominant view in the literature in the 1950s and 60s was that state had an important role to play in economic development, and that it must undertake activities which are required to correct what is called market failure. Market failure is a term that economists use to indicate a situation in which markets do not perform their function. Market failure was also particularly felt in the area of investment, or what economists would like to call allocation of resources over time. That is because of the myopic character of the participants. The literature also at that time underlined the fact that undertaking a set of consistent and coordinated investment decisions is good for the economy. It is this line of thinking which led not only India, but many other countries in the world to adopt what is called nationwide economic planning. In the early period, the strategy of economic development that India adopted had 4 elements. One, as I mentioned earlier, a strong state intervention. The other element in the strategy of development was that the savings and investment rate must go up. In fact, Arthur Lewis, who taught at Princeton, who later got a Nobel Prize, wrote in 1954, and I quote, "The central issue for development economics was to understand how a country which saves 5% of its income is transformed into one which saves 20% of its income." So the emphasis on promoting savings and investment, state intervention, a high savings and interest rate, investment rate. And thirdly was the idea that import substitution is important. That is the idea that whatever we are importing, we should make in India. And fourthly, the fourth element in the strategy of development was that the industrial growth must focus attention on the manufacture of capital goods. The intellectual support for the manufacture of the capital goods industry came from the Mahalanobis model, which in my opinion is strictly valid only in a closed economy. In an open economy, it does not necessarily hold good. But one impact of this was that India became a high-cost economy. And as a high-cost economy, and also it led to a situation in which the exports of India, which at that particular time, I'm talking of 1950, constituted 2% of the global trade, came down in the next few decades to less than half of 1%. There was a steep fall in the export of goods by India as a percentage of world trade. So, but let me also add, to some extent, policymakers in India in the 1950s and 60s cannot be blamed, or they were in fact handicapped, because at that particular time, there was no clear model available for a developing country to move fast or to grow fast. And therefore, a little bit of experimentation was essentially required. But by the end of 1970s, it was almost becoming clear that the model that we have adopted needs change. I would not say the model needed to be discarded. The model needed change. But our policymakers did not think at that time the need to make a change. And it is at that time, more or less, China adopted a change in the strategy of development. The famous Deng's speech was delivered on 13th December 1978. And he called, and I quote, to explore new ways and generate new ideas. One interesting statistic. China, in 1980, in current dollars, India's per capita income was 266, while that of China, what do you think, was less at 194. This is as late as 1980. In 2020, India's was $1,900, while that of China was $10,500. I'm not saying that the entire difference is due only because of the change in the strategy of development, but the change in the strategy of development did make an important difference. In fact, the change in view came only at the time of the crisis of 1990-91. It was the crisis of 1991 that compelled the policymakers in India to an idea whose time had come, as the budget of Manmohan Singh said at that time. The break with the past came in three important ways. One, the complex system of controls, permits, and licenses were removed. Second, the role of state intervention was modified. And third important change in the strategy of development was to give up the import substitution approach and to embrace world trade and compete and be prepared to compete with other countries in world trade. These are three major changes that occurred in the reform period of early 1990s. There is one common thread running through all the measures that were introduced since 1991, and that is to improve the efficiency of the system by creating a more competitive environment. The changes in the industrial policy, which led to the giving up of all controls and permits, was intended to promote domestic competitiveness all the changes in the foreign trade policy were intended to enhance the global competitiveness, subject, of course, to the customs duties which were themselves coming down. There is one point that needs to be noted. It is true that the area of operation for the private sector increased. Some of the areas which were exclusively reserved for the state were also thrown open to the private sector, like power, aviation, and so on. But there is nothing in the new economic policy which reduces the role of the state. The role of the state in terms of enhancing the social and physical infrastructure has in fact increased since that time. As it has been somewhat critically remarked, more market does not mean less government, but different government. And that is really what the new economic policy means. What has been the record of India's growth before reforms and post-reforms? What has been the impact of the reforms on the balance of payment situation? What has been the impact of reforms on the level of poverty and the poverty ratio that we can measure? India's average growth till the end of 1970s remained around 3.6%, with population growing at that time at 2.2%, the per capita income growth was 1.4%. Therefore, India's economy did grow. As I told you earlier, compared to the British rule in the 5 decades of the 20th century, Indian economy did pick up, the growth rate started rising, and we had an increase in the per capita income. But that is, as I shall show later on, less than what we desired. As you know, almost all 5-year plans talked about the expected rate of growth during that plan period was 5%. And as somebody said, our fascination with increase in the 5th 5-year plan when the objective was set as 5.5%. But we fell short of that. And it's also true that at the same time, if you look at the performance of countries like South Korea or Malaysia, their growth rate at that particular time was much higher. So let us recognize what we have achieved. Continuous an average growth rate of 3.6% is certainly far better than 0.89% that what we had, what the British rule showed, and therefore we understand that, but it fell short of our expectations. And also we must also note that there are many social indicators, health indicators, like life expectancy, the literacy rate, the number of women attending colleges, all of that showed substantial improvement during this particular period. Even though at the beginning of the period, we had to depend upon imports of food grains. After the advent of the Green Revolution, there was a big change in agriculture. The industrial base was widened, which included the production of steel and even heavy electrical goods and so on and so forth. In the 1980s, the economic growth picked up. In 1980s, the economic growth was almost 5.8%. But then what happened? But that high growth was bought at a high cost. There was a huge increase in gross fiscal deficit. There was a huge increase in the current account deficit. That resulted in the crisis of 1991, and the growth rate fell to about 1% in 91-92. So if looking back, as you see, that while India did make progress, did make considerable efforts to widen the industrial base, the development of agriculture, it is not something that it is something well below our expectations and something behind what some of the countries had achieved. I do have the numbers in the written note, but let me see. Yes, I do have it here. See, South Korea, for example, in 1960 had a per capita income of 158. In 1980, the per capita income was 1,715, whereas India's was 266.58. More or less, we started at the same level, but South Korea did perform much better than India. In fact, if you look at another 10 years more, South Korea did even put in even superior performance. As you know, that as of now, India is classified in the category of lower middle income country. But South Korea is a developed country now. That is, its economic status is a developed country. I mean, there are people who argue about whether what is true of a small country like South Korea can be true of a large country like India. What applies to a small country like South Korea may not apply to a larger country like India. But then came the example of China, which once again has really done much better. But the reforms did introduce a big change in the Indian economic picture. I will quote only a few numbers. Between 1992-93 and 2001, the economic growth, annual growth was 6.2%. Between 2001-2 and 12-13, it grew by 7.4%. And the growth rate between 2013-14 and 2019-20 is 6.7%. Certainly, we are in the range of 6 to 7%. And therefore, the growth rate, the best growth rate that we had was between 2005-6 and 2007-8. In those 3 years, India's economic growth exceeded 9% per annum. This is according to the 2004-5 base national income computation. 2008-9 was the international financial crisis. You include that year, and 2 following years, even then, India's economic growth was something like 8%. Therefore, we showed at that particular time the potential of Indian economy, that it has the capability to grow at around 8% in a very sustained period. In fact, that period also showed many other things. Our balance of payment situation improved considerably. I will say a few more words later on. The investment rate rose almost to about 37% during that particular period. Therefore, until about 2011-12, the economy did extremely well, giving us the hope that India can get out of being a middle-income country. But unfortunately, after 2011-12, the growth rate fell. Why? I think that is important for policymakers to understand, because only then we can remedy the situation and move on to do what is necessary and what is useful. In fact, some of the reasons are quite obvious. One is that in almost all economies, when the economy grows up and reaches its full capacity, then it begins to fall. This is what we call in economics a cyclical turndown. The capacity utilization rate in 2010-11 had almost touched 83%. That is, the economy was operating at near full capacity. And therefore, at that particular time, the investment tends to fall, and that leads to a fall in growth. So the first reason is the cyclical character of all economies. It's not only ours, but also everywhere. In one sense, I must also say, when I say that the 2005-06 period, the 5 years following 2005-06 was a good period, we must also note that was a good period for the world as a whole also. India was not something performing as distinct from other countries. And the crisis came in the developed countries at 2008-09. In a sense, our crisis came after 2011-12. The first reason is cyclical. The second reason is that during the period when the economy was booming, there was a large flow of credit to the real sector, that is industry and services. And when the economy started slowing down, automatically the net result was that some of the projects which were viable earlier became unviable, and that led, as you all know, to the increase in what we call the non-performing assets. Bankers are not totally to blame. At the time when the project was granted, it was considered to be viable. But it turned unviable once the growth rate started falling. And there are, I will not go into it, I think there are other reasons that one can talk about. For example, in some sense, the growth rate of 2009-10 and 2010-11 was as a consequence of the high fiscal deficit that the government of India incurred. And one consequence of that was a huge inflation that we had in 2011-12 and so on. Therefore, that essentially had an adverse effect upon growth. So several factors, and I will not go into the other factors that one can talk about. But basically, let me summarize what I said on growth. As I said, up to the end of 1970s, the growth rate was good, comparable to the British period, but it fell short of what we desired and we wanted to achieve. The per capita income growth rate was only of the order of 1.3 or 1.4%. Post-reforms, the rate of growth of the economy started increasing. And between 2005-06 and 2010-11, we had almost the best period that the Indian economy ever had. But post-2011-12, the economy started falling for a variety of reasons. Now, in some sense, the growth of the economy post-2013-14 is a very complicated analysis because of the fact that we introduced a new national income series with a new base, 2011-12, and there were many criticisms about the new national income series based on 2011-12. I cannot go into the technicalities of that this evening, but that is why comparison of the growth rate after 2013-14 with the previous ones becomes somewhat difficult. Because, for example, when 2016-17, when demonetization was introduced, and which caused a larger hardship for the people, according to the new time series on national income, the rate of growth of the economy was 8%. Leaving aside that, by 2019-20, the national income had fallen to almost about 3.2%. Therefore, this is prior to COVID. Therefore, we should really introspect as to why this happened, why it fell to such a low level. One thing is obvious, that the investment rate of the economy fell during this period from 33% of the GDP to something like 28% of the GDP. This is a contributing factor to the fall in the growth rate. COVID-19 spelt a big problem for the country. It is not so much the pandemic which was the cause of the problem as far as the economy is concerned, but it is the actions that are to be taken to prevent the spread of COVID-19 that resulted in the economy suffering a lot. The shutdowns meant lack of mobility of goods and services as well as people. That led to the decline in the growth rate. If you study and look at the phenomenon of COVID-19, under the first wave, the human loss was less. And in the second wave, the human loss was more. The human loss was less in the first period because the lockdowns were enforced more severely. But in the second wave, lockdowns were relaxed, and that resulted in a larger fatalities and loss of life. As somebody said, this is a conflict between what we call life and livelihood. Which is important? Is it livelihood or life? Now, in one sense, life is extremely important. I mean, you can't put a value on it that way. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that the actions taken to prevent the spread of COVID resulted in the income going down. As you all know, that the 2021, the economy fell by 6.6%, and the 21-22, it got up by 8.8%. But at the end of 21-22, we were exactly where we were at the end of 2019-20. 1 year's loss was made up by the next year, almost. And as far as the economy is concerned, we lost 2 years. The likelihood of the growth rate in 22-23 is being debated. I personally think that we need to somewhat reconcile with a growth rate of something like 7% during this year. And remember, even that is over the base of 2019-20. Because the first quarter numbers that have come for the current year, 22-23, is somewhat less than what people had expected earlier. And on that basis, our own calculation comes to 6.8% for the current year. Perhaps if income picks up later, it could be 7%. But I do not think the rate of growth of the economy for 22-23 can be more than 7%. The other thing is 22-23 could have been the normal year, but for the Russian-Ukraine war. That had resulted in two things: a huge increase in the price level, a general decline in the growth rate in the world economy. All of this have contributed to have an impact upon our own growth rate. So that is why I said, taking all these factors into account, we should be happy if we get 7% this year. Now let me very briefly talk about two other things and come to more important issues. The balance of payment situation considerably improved in the post-reform period. Many of you may remember that we went to the International Monetary Fund in 1981 seeking assistance. In 1991, we went again to the International Monetary Fund seeking assistance. I call this the 10-year itch. Fortunately, we have overcome the 10-year itch. We have been able to have a reasonable performance on the balance of payment sector. In fact, I would call it the success story of the reforms. But then you can talk about what is happening currently. This is because that our balance of payments is affected by several things, and one of which is important is the inflow of funds from outside. You can ask the question, why is the rupee behaving in the way in which it is behaving now? The value of the rupee is now fluctuating between 79 rupees to your dollar and 80 rupees to your dollar. This is almost a fall of something like 4 rupees to the, that is, the dollar has strengthened by almost 4 to 5 rupees per dollar. This is essentially because of the fact that the value of the rupee is affected not only by our exports and imports, but also of capital inflows. Capital inflows, when they come in, they boost the value of the rupee. But when the capital inflows flow outside, that is when there is an outflow of capital, then the value of the rupee loses. That is what is happening now. But I do believe that as capital inflows resume once again, the value of the rupee may once again get strengthened, but it will not go back to the pre-crisis level. Very quickly, I have something to say on poverty ratio, but given the time, I will skip it, but only mention one important fact. That is, in the period of 2005-06 to 2010-11, when the economy was growing strongly, the poverty ratio came down very substantially because of two reasons. As growth happens, it percolates to all sections of the society. Maybe some sections get more, but some sections get less, but it does percolate to all sections of the society. Second, as growth happens, the resources of the government also increase, and therefore they can be utilized for providing social safety nets. Please remember, it was a period during 2005-06 and 2011-12, we introduced a rural employment guarantee scheme. We introduced the extended food security system, and so on. All of these are important social safety nets, and this is what happened as a consequence of the growth being there. In fact, there is some question about whether the way in which we calculate the poverty ratio is appropriate or not. In fact, there was a committee under my chairmanship to re-examine whether the poverty measurement that we have been adopting is appropriate or not. But then there are others also who have reported. I want to read one comment from the Oxford study, which uses what is called the multidimensional poverty index. You look at several indicators. Do people have the right kind of homes? How many people are able to afford this or afford that in terms of clothing or in terms of housing and so on. So in 2018, released by UNDP and Oxford University says, India has made momentous progress in reducing multidimensional poverty. The incidence of multidimensional poverty was almost halved between 2005-06 and 2015-16, climbing down to 27.5%. The global multidimensional poverty index was cut by half due to deeper progress among the poorest. Thus, within 10 years, the number of poor people in India fell by more than 271 million, a truly massive gain. This only corroborates what our own measurement of poverty has also shown. But what is the current situation? The growth rate has fallen, and we have had the impact of COVID-19. Therefore, one might perhaps wonder what the poverty ratio now is. For measuring the poverty ratio, that we need the consumption expenditure survey, which has not been conducted after 2011-12. Or it was conducted once, but its data were not released. Therefore, we need to conduct the consumer expenditure survey soon. I think there are actions being taken, but that has to be done in a proper way, and there are some problems associated with it. Now let me come very quickly to 2 or 3 issues and leave it there. What are the lessons that we can learn from our reform experience? What does it show? The reform agenda has been continued in one way or the other. Almost every government that came after it did that. The reforms have been expanded from what we had done in the beginning. I would like to say that the reforms of 1991 were well coordinated and addressed the issues in a number of areas. Reforms were introduced in the area of fiscal policy. Reforms were introduced in the area of monetary policy. Reforms were introduced in relation to banking system. And reforms were introduced in terms of the liberalization of the foreign trade. Reforms were introduced in changing the exchange rate system, and so on. Therefore, if you look at it, you will find that the reforms introduced in the early 1990s had a composite character and addressed many issues in a very consistent way. The question about, as we go ahead, is the reform agenda must continue. And there is enough evidence to show that the reforms lead to higher growth, but that is not automatic. It has to be followed up, because, as I said earlier, the investment rate has fallen, Reforms generally help to raise the investment rate, but that has not happened. Therefore, even as we introduce reforms, we need to address some of the issues that arise in specific industries and specific areas. Then the center and the states must be joint partners in the reform. As I see it, the power sector, the financial sector, the governance, and even agricultural marketing do require reforms. But one thing is important. Discussion and consensus building must be an integral part of introducing reforms. What happened under the shadow of a crisis cannot be expected to happen all the time. Therefore, understanding and creating an environment in which the reform measures are introduced is acceptable is critically important. Timing and sequencing is equally important. Labor law reforms, for example, are best undertaken when the economy is in the upswing. Then people realize that these labor law reforms do not come in the way of growth. So, to be credible and acceptable, reforms must not only result in higher growth, but also benefit all sections of the society. In that sense, reforms are not ends in themselves. But at the same time, we should understand equity will be a distant dream unless it is supported by growth. Reforms, growth, and equity must constitute the triad of economic policy, and they are mutually reinforcing. Let me conclude with a few observations on what lies ahead. As we look ahead, we need to see that we must get back to the higher growth path. And for achieving the higher growth path, as I have repeatedly said, we must get the investment rate back to 33%. Only then it will be possible to be able to get the higher growth rate. Initially, we must get back to 7%, and possibly thereafter we can move to 8 to 9%. And as I said, that the investment needs to come from the private sector also. In a crisis period, increased capital expenditures on the part of the government may crowd in private investment rather than crowd out private investment. But that cannot be the normal. As we proceed further, private investment, both corporate and non-corporate, must increase and add to the total investment rate so that we get back to the growth rate, get back to the higher investment rate of 33%. The other important thing that we will have to address is what happens because of the new technologies. What are the implications of new technologies on growth, on employment, both immediate and secular? We cannot be an outsider to new technologies. Then we will lose our competitiveness. But at the same time, we need to watch what the absorption of new technologies mean. Take, for example, the automobile industry. Let us see that we all move from the present system, the present model of internal combustion engines to electrical vehicles. One immediate advantage is that we save foreign exchange because there will be a lot less of import of oil, petroleum products. But it can also result in the import of certain other commodities which we are not producing because of the introduction of electrical vehicles. Cheap imports will become important. And therefore, we will have to think in terms of establishing industries which manufacture the input requirements of electrical vehicles. Therefore, we need to, and the employment implications is even more. It is not only we, but also the developed countries are concerned about the employment implications of the new technologies. Many of you may know that today, Belgium has moved to a 3-day weekend. It's not only Saturday, Sunday, but Friday is also a holiday. Because they think that with the introduction of the new technologies, they don't need so many people. But that is something that will have a very disastrous effect for a country like India. So how do we match the implications of new technologies with the expansion of employment is something that we need to think hard. The future development of agriculture and other service sectors will require a considerable amount of planning and thinking. Bearing in mind the fact that external investment may not be fully forthcoming, not forthcoming, bearing in mind that the external investment is a reflection of the current account deficit, we will have to see that the investment rate goes up as a consequence of domestic investment. One other point. People raise the questions, what should be the strategy of development for India? Should it be emphasis on exports? There is one model which is called export-led growth. That is, exports rise and therefore they pull the economy forward. That is what is meant by export-led growth. To some extent, China succeeded in doing that. But as far as India is concerned, I feel that it cannot be unidimensional. We need a strong export growth sector. We need a strong manufacturing sector so that even that export sector can be helped. And also, a strong manufacturing sector will provide opportunities for employment of people with various talent. People talk about, in management terminology, that one has to assess the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses, when they talk about the firm, are internal. Opportunities and threats are external. As a country, where do we stand? We really have a strong institutional framework, if you look at it in terms of strength. We are today the 5th largest economy in the world, therefore there is strength in terms of the aggregate output. And there is the strong institutional framework is a help in pushing the economy forward. But the weakness is also there. One of the weaknesses is the lack of a coordination between the center and states, and so on. It will take more time to elaborate this. But opportunities. The global situation is both a plus and a minus. The global situation is such that it can lead to an expansion of the Indian economy. As I mentioned to you, that India's share in the world exports fell down from 2% to less than half of 1%. Post-reform period, it has started increasing. But we still are not close to 2% of world exports. Even though world exports may fall down, since our share in the total world exports is so small, there is still an opportunity for us to move ahead. But the external sector also poses a problem because of the fact that many estimates, there's a recent OECD study which shows that the growth rate of the advanced countries may slow down from now on. Then that has a negative implication as far as India is concerned. We have been talking recently about India's wanting to become a $5 trillion economy. What does the arithmetic show? The arithmetic shows that from the present level, which is 2.7 trillion US dollars, that is the strength of the Indian economy, to get to $5 trillion economy, India has to grow at a rate of growth between 8 and 9% for 5 consecutive years. Only then we will get there. There is also a question that people are asking. We are today 75 years after independence. In 2047, we'll be 100 years from independence. Will, by 2047, India become a developed economy? It can. But that requires growing at the rate of almost about 7% per annum for the next 2 decades and more. That is really the challenge before us, whether we can do that. And that is why I would say that we really need to focus on growth. The exclusive attention of the policymakers must be on growth and leave other considerations out of mind. India, as you say, is the 5th largest economy. That is true. We have been improving. In 1990, we were the 13th largest economy. So we have now moved to be the 5th largest economy. But ours is also a large country. And therefore, that needs to be taken into account. That's an impressive achievement. There's no doubt about it. But if you look at it in terms of per capita income, we are still very low. We are 142 in the ranking out of 196 countries in terms of per capita income. Therefore, the challenge and the opportunity before us is to grow fast. We need to do that. Growth is the answer to many of your socio-economic problems. Many social and community problems can be better resolved. Solutions can be found better in a growing economy. But in terms of per capita income, we have to go a long way. And that is really the goal. And in order to do this, we must certainly need to grow. Need not only to grow, but also need to run fast. Or should I say, run faster. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rangarajan. We have been very much absorbed in your speech and ideas spelled out. I now request Sriman Shantanu Paul to propose a vote of thanks. So I request all the listeners kindly go downstairs after the function is over for a cup of tea and refreshment.
Well, first of all, it's my proud and privileged duty to be offering a vote of thanks after this wonderful and powerful speech. I think all of you who came to listen to a good speech were rewarded with a masterclass in India's growth story. So that itself is a reward. I'd like to extend another round of applause to Dr. Rangarajan for this stellar performance. As Moharaj said earlier, he's a youthful 90-year-old person, and we can see that in his vigor. I'm sure if you'd given him another 1 hour, he could have gone on just fine. So let me first start by extending my great gratitude to the Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture, and especially Swami Shupurnandaji, Shotuda to us, beloved Shotuda from our Narendrapur days. As he mentioned, he was my college principal when I was a student there. And I'm sure all the other Swamijis here and this entire setup of Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture for giving us such a great platform to set up the Samar Kanti Pal Memorial Lecture, for which we are extremely grateful. The family is very grateful. And I also want to shout out to Shayok Chakraborty, if he's here in the room, for providing me great support in the whole planning of this event. Thank you for that. Of course, no words enough for Dr. C. Rangarajan and for the trouble he has taken. I think some of you may be surprised to know that in the last 3 years, he's written more than 100 articles, op-ed articles, between the age of 87 and 90, and his new book is coming out in 1 month on his journey at RBI and beyond. I'd like to also thank the learned audience here who have braved the Calcutta inclement weather to be here, and I'm sure that, really grateful for your presence, and hopefully as we build up this lecture over the next few years, we'll see you again for further speakers on different topics as time goes on. Members of the media who are present, thank you for coming, and I would like to also mention that after this session is over from the stage, you can proceed to the reception room, where we'll have Dr. Rangarajan available for about 15-20 minutes for you to interact with him. I'm sure some of you have a lot of questions. Some of you have come all the way and told us that you want to interact with him. So we'll make that possible. Hope Dr. CR is okay with it. Family and friends, I think a lot of family here, a lot of friends here, friends of my father's, especially, who were with him in college days. Some of them are here. I don't want to name anybody individually, but those of you here, we're really grateful for your presence. I think Baba had a long track record of having great friends, and that's a wonderful thing. And of course, the family has been extremely supportive in setting up this. Many of the family members, as was mentioned, have been part of setting up this memorial lecture. Let me sort of say a few words about personal words at this point regarding some of my personal experiences. By the way, I should also mention that those who are here from friends and family, we are setting up a room downstairs. In fact, if Anand Ghosh is here, if you can give a few sound clips or video clips of your experience with my father, late Samar Kanti Pal, we are trying to build a little biopic or a film for next year, which we can play. So if you can give some of your own experiences, share a few minutes of your time after this event is over. My sister Hoimanti will help you go around and get your videos recorded. We'll make it very quick and short. So thank you for doing that, if you can. This is open for all of you who know him personally or otherwise. I want to spend a few minutes thanking, and please indulge me for doing this, because Shotuda is here, and I think I'm one of those few people who has the benefit of many father figures, right? Shotuda was elder brother to us in Narendrapur. I lived in the room next to his in Brahmananda Hostel on the 3rd floor. So I think my journey of having great leadership influences started with Shotuda. So I'm very grateful for he suggesting the lecture be organized here, memorial lecture, helping me set up the whole process, and then also requesting that we have Dr. Rangarajan be the first speaker. All those ideas came from Shotuda. So thank you very much for that, Shotuda. We are very grateful. Of course, Dr. Rangarajan, in his capacity as an economist, he is world-renowned, globally renowned economist and a great policy maker. We all know that. Needs no introduction. But even as a human being, he's a very compassionate and caring human being. So he has filled a big void in our lives in the absence of our father. I'm sure many members of my family will say that he has played a great father figure role for all of us in the next generation. And no words will be complete with my mother, Jayanti Pal, who's sitting here. In the absence of my father, she had to play double duty, full-time mother and proxy father. So last Father's Day, I called my mother and wished her Father's Day. And I called Dr. Rangarajan and wished him Father's Day as well. So that actually is some of the words I want to say about all of these wonderful people. And last but not the least, a few words of maybe a vote of thanks to my father himself. Those of you who knew him know this very well, and of course, the anecdotes offered were very interesting in the very beginning. He was clearly a visionary, well ahead of his times, both in terms of academics, in terms of embracing technology, and in terms of this whole idea of becoming an entrepreneur. Very rare, almost unthinkable in those days. He was also a very good sportsman. He played great football and loved all kinds of sports, had an adventurous spirit. So he was a man of adventure, not just a man of vision. And he had a great sense of humor, which made him a great storyteller. Those of you who heard him telling stories would know that he had this incredible way with telling stories. So I think all of the people who have touched his lives and vice versa would say that he was, to his children, a great father, to his parents, a great son, to his brothers, sisters, and cousins, a great brother, and to my mother, a compassionate husband, and to all his friends, a very loyal and trusted friend. I think most people can aspire to be that. I think that's a great achievement by itself. So I think in short, I would say that what is the legacy that he left us? The legacy he gave us, for which we give thanks, is that he taught us to think very big, to aim very high, and to be totally fearless. So with that, I thank all of you for being here and hope to see all of you again next year. Thank you.